I want to start with a confession. I didn't go looking for this. I wasn't chasing water. I was following something else entirely. The food forests, the old growth systems, the agricultural networks that seemed to vanish without explanation sometime in the late 19th century. And I kept hitting the same wall, the same institutional silence, the same missing transition records, documents that should exist, don't, photographs that should show something, show nothing, and then the redirection, always the redirection toward an official explanation that answers every surface question while somehow never addressing the one underneath. And then, almost by accident, I found the water. Not a river, not a reservoir, not a municipal aquifer with a permit date stamped on a county record. I found something older, something that doesn't behave the way water is supposed to behave, something that was there before the cities, before the roads, before the official historical record even bothers to acknowledge that anyone was living in those places at all. And here's what stopped me cold. These sources, scattered across 5 continents, separated by thousands of miles and entirely different geological formations, share one characteristic that no one seems to want to talk about. They are all in various ways restricted, sealed, off-limits, heavily managed, quietly removed from public access, under a rotating cast of explanations: environmental protection, mineral rights, sacred designation, military jurisdiction, ongoing scientific research. The explanations change, the restriction doesn't. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start in Mexico. 2 locations separated by nearly 1,000 miles of desert and mountain, connected by something I'm still trying to articulate. The first is Hierve el Agua, in the highlands of Oaxaca. If you've never seen photographs of this place, I need you to understand what you're looking at before I tell you what the official explanation says. The site appears from a distance like a frozen waterfall, cascading formations of white and ochre stone spilling over the edge of a cliff face. Frozen mid-pour, monumental in scale. Except they're not frozen. They're not stone exactly. They're mineral deposits built over time by water that carries enough calcium carbonate to, essentially, construct its own landscape as it moves through it. The water builds rock, in real time, incrementally, continuously, without interruption. The official framing calls this petrified waterfalls and a natural mineral precipitation phenomenon, and in the narrowest technical sense, that's accurate. The chemistry is understood, except the formations at Hierve el Agua don't behave like comparable mineral spring sites anywhere else on record. The scale is wrong. The geometry is wrong. The distribution of mineral buildup follows patterns that, when you look at them long enough, begin to suggest deliberate orientation, as if the water is being directed somewhere specific. The terrace pools at the top, which are where the springs actually emerge, show signs of modification that predate any colonial record. And the full spring network, the complete system above and beyond the tourist terraces, is restricted. Not developed, not open, not mapped in any publicly available form. And then there are the older accounts, not academic papers, not colonial surveys, the kind of sources that don't get cited in official literature precisely because they're inconvenient. Oral records, regional histories, the kind of thing that gets quietly filed under folklore and left there. What they describe, in varying forms across several generations of Zapotec oral tradition, is a spring that wasn't just building rock, a spring that was, by some accounts, responding to season, to use, to the presence of the agricultural system surrounding it, that the mineral formations weren't incidental byproduct, but something closer to output, the spring expressing, in stone, whatever it was processing. Whether that means anything verifiable, I genuinely don't know. But I also don't know how to explain why those accounts disappeared from regional documentation at almost exactly the same moment the upper network was quietly closed off. The whispers stopped. The access stopped. At the same time. This raises a simple but critical question. If it's just mineral-rich water flowing downhill, Why does the upper network require restriction at all? What is the full system doing that the curated portion doesn't show? And then there's Cuatro Ciénegas. Drive north through Coahuila into the Chihuahuan Desert, one of the most arid, inhospitable environments coming in North America, and at some point the desert simply stops making sense. In a valley with no geological reason to contain water, a network of spring-fed pools and rivers emerges from the earth, clear and still and completely out of place. The official explanation collapses here almost immediately. Because the geological conditions don't account for what's present, this water shouldn't exist in this volume, in this location, at all, and it's not just the location that defies explanation. Researchers who have been granted access to the spring system, and there aren't many, have noted something in the water chemistry that doesn't appear in documentation from comparable desert spring systems anywhere else. The mineral composition shifts, not seasonally, not in response to rainfall or temperature in any way that correlates cleanly with the data. It shifts in ways that suggest the system is doing something internally, processing, adjusting, maintaining a chemical equilibrium that has no obvious source. One hydrological survey from the early 2000s, which I found cited in a single paper and then never again, described the output water as chemically distinct from the input water in ways that the researchers could measure but not account for. Something was happening between the water entering the system and the water leaving it. What that something was, the paper didn't conclude. The research, as far as I can tell, wasn't continued. But stranger than the water are the things living in it. Organisms, stromatolites, microbial mats that are genetically distinct from anything found elsewhere on Earth. Not variations, not close relatives. Organisms whose lineage predates every known timeline for complex life in this hemisphere. And NASA mentions it, which, depending on how much you trust NASA, either lends this place credibility or raises entirely different questions. What I'll say is that even by their accounts, what's living in that water doesn't fit the timeline. You can take the space agency framing or leave it. I tend to leave it. But strip that away and you're still left with organisms in a desert pool that have no biological relatives anywhere on Earth and no explanation for how they got there or how long they've been waiting. Independent research at Cuatro Ciénegas is heavily restricted. Access to the full spring network requires governmental authorization. The public can observe portions. The deeper water, the subterranean connections, the full microbial survey remains officially ongoing research. Not completed, not published in full, ongoing, indefinitely. 2 Mexican spring systems, 2 sets of behaviors that precede every official record. 2 restricted networks sitting above a publicly managed surface that shows you enough to answer the tourist question without ever touching the one underneath. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Now I want to take you somewhere that feels entirely different on the surface. Southern Oregon. A body of water so strikingly blue it looks like something generated by software. Crater Lake. The official narrative is clean and confident. Roughly 7,700 years ago, a massive volcanic peak known as Mount Mazama collapsed in on itself following a catastrophic eruption. The resulting caldera gradually filled with rainfall and snowmelt. No rivers flow into it, no rivers flow out of it. What you have, officially, is the deepest lake in the United States, nearly 2,000 feet at its maximum depth, sustained entirely by precipitation. Here's what the official explanation doesn't fully address. The water clarity at Crater Lake is, by any scientific measurement, extraordinary. We're talking visibility depths of over 100 feet. The lake consistently ranks among the clearest bodies of water on Earth. And for a closed basin lake, a lake with no inflow and no outlet, this creates a problem that geologists have been quietly puzzling over for decades. Closed systems accumulate. They collect minerals, sediment, biological material. They cloud. They stratify. They over time become something different than what they started as. Crater Lake doesn't do this. The official explanation attempts to account for the purity through a combination of low mineral input, the filtering effect of the volcanic rock substrate, and the absence of major tributaries carrying sediment. Fine. Partially satisfying. Except the lake also exhibits what researchers have called hydrothermal vent activity on its floor, active systems that are continuously introducing heat and mineral content from below. Hydrothermal vents, in every other body of water where they've been studied, create distinct chemical gradients. They alter the surrounding water chemistry in measurable, significant ways. At Crater Lake, this effect appears to be, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, neutralized, counteracted, as if something in the system is processing what comes in from below and maintaining equilibrium. A self-correcting system. That's where this becomes impossible to ignore, because that's not what closed volcanic lakes do. That's what engineered systems do. Now, I'm not saying someone built Crater Lake. I'm asking something simpler, and I think more unsettling. Is it possible that what we're looking at is not a geological accident, but the surviving remnant of something designed to work exactly this way? And if so, designed by whom? And when? The lake is, officially, under National Park Service management. Certain portions of the shoreline and the water itself are under research permit restrictions. Access to the caldera rim and the hydrothermal zones below the surface requires specific authorization. The Park Service frames this as environmental protection, and maybe it is. But I keep coming back to the question of what is being protected. The lake from us, or the information about the lake from us? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. If this is your first time here, I want to be clear about what we're doing. We're not drawing conclusions, we're following anomalies. We're asking why the same kinds of questions keep producing the same kinds of silence from the same kinds of institutions. If that's something you want to keep exploring, consider sharing this video, or become a YouTube member, because we're only getting started. Beppu, Japan. A city on the northeastern coast of Kyushu Island sitting atop one of the most concentrated geothermal spring systems on Earth. The numbers are, by any measure, astonishing. Over 2,000 registered spring sources within the city limits. More hot spring output than anywhere else in Japan, which is itself one of the most geothermally active nations on the planet. The city's entire infrastructure, its hotels, its bathhouses, its heating systems, is organized around this underground network as if the city was built for the springs, rather than the springs being incidental to the city. And that framing, that the city exists in service to the water, not the other way around, is one I want you to hold on to. Because there are springs in Beppu that are not open to the public. Not in the sense of being temporarily closed, not in the sense of being under renovation. Permanently, categorically, restricted. The most well-known of these are the so-called jigoku, the hells, a series of dramatically coloured thermal pools whose chemistry produces visual effects ranging from deep blood red to vivid cobalt blue to an opalescent, almost milky turquoise. 7 of these pools are maintained as tourist attractions. You can pay admission, walk the paths, take photographs, but there are others, the less discussed ones, the ones that don't appear on the tourist maps, that local sources will acknowledge only obliquely, that appear in Meiji-era records as active and significant, and then simply stop appearing. Not because the springs stopped, the springs are still there, still flowing, still visible in some cases to anyone who gets close enough to the restricted perimeter. What stopped was the documentation. The official framing positions the restricted areas as either privately owned, structurally unsafe for public access, or under ongoing geothermal research. And maybe those explanations are accurate. But here's the strangest part. The network beneath Beppu is not fully mapped, not completely. In a modern city with ground-penetrating radar, satellite thermal imaging, seismic monitoring equipment capable of detecting microtremors below the surface, the full extent of what's flowing under Beppu remains officially unknown. The city acknowledges this. It's not a secret. It's presented as a feature, almost, a charming mystery, an entire city built on an unmapped system. Portions of that system permanently restricted, and the accepted response is a kind of civic shrug. There's more down there, we just don't know what. I'm not satisfied with that shrug. And the deeper I went into the historical record, the less satisfying it became. Meiji era surveys from the 1870s and 1880s, a period of intense Western-influenced modernization in Japan, contain descriptions of spring behaviors in the Beppu Basin that don't match current readings. Temperature variations that don't appear in contemporary measurements, output volumes that seem inconsistent with what we're told the system currently produces. Either the surveys were wrong, or something changed, and here's the part that keeps me up. We know the late 1800s were a period of significant alteration across many of the systems we've been tracking. The food forests disappear in roughly this window. Old architectural forms disappear. Certain agricultural technologies vanish from the record. Is it possible that the springs of Beppu were also, in some meaningful way, modified during this period? Reduced? Partially sealed? I'm not saying that someone turned off a tap. I'm asking whether someone found a tap and turned it down. Now, Croatia, the Plitvice Lakes. And this is where I want to spend some time, because Plitvice does something that I believe, once you understand it, reframes everything we've been discussing. The lakes are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, 16 terraced lakes connected by waterfalls, cascades and caves spread across a forested valley in central Croatia. They are objectively, undeniably, one of the most visually striking landscapes on Earth. If you've seen photographs, you understand why. If you haven't, I want you to stop and look them up. I'll wait. What makes Plitvice unusual, officially unusual, not even getting into the stranger territory, is the travertine, the rock. The lakes are lined, dammed and continuously shaped by travertine barriers, limestone deposits that are precipitated out of the water by a specific combination of microorganisms, mineral chemistry, and flow dynamics. These barriers are not static. They grow, they shift, they reshape the course of the water, which in turn affects when new barriers form, which changes the water's path, which changes the barrier formation. The system modifies its own architecture in real time. The official explanation frames this as natural geochemical process, and in the narrow sense, that's accurate. Travertine formation is understood. The microbial component, mostly algae and moss, is well documented. But the behavior of the system as a whole, its capacity to maintain a stable series of lakes over centuries while continuously altering its own physical structure, represents something more sophisticated than most natural processes we study. Natural systems don't usually maintain stability through constant self-modification. They tend toward entropy. They drift. They change in one direction. Plitvice has been, as far as historical records extend, in a state of continuous self-maintenance. The lakes don't fill in. They don't drain. They don't become a single basin despite the continuous dissolution of their travertine barriers. Something in the system resets the balance. Something keeps it working. And here's what started pulling at the edges of my thinking. Large portions of the Plitvice Lake system are designated as research zones, areas within the national park that are accessible only to authorized scientific personnel. The public walkways trace the perimeter of the lake system, offering views without access. The underwater portions, the cave systems, the deeper lake floors, the subsurface channels connecting the lakes are substantially unmapped and formally restricted. In a system this studied, this photographed, this UNESCO designated, why does the subsurface remain opaque? The evidence suggests something much larger when you start mapping what we're not being shown. The public faces of these systems, the tourist walkways at Plitvice, the admission-priced hells of Beppu, the rim trail at Crater Lake begin to look like something else when viewed together. Not access, a managed reveal, a curated presentation that shows you enough to satisfy the question while keeping the actual mechanism out of view. Show you the lake, restrict the depth, show you the spring, seal the source, show you the water, keep the system proprietary. And this is where I need to slow down and ask a harder question, because I know what the counter-argument is. Crater Lake is in Oregon, Beppu is in Japan, Plitvice is in Croatia, Hierva El Agua and Cuatro Ciénegas are in Mexico. These places have nothing to do with each other. Different governments, different geological contexts, different cultural histories, different agencies managing different restrictions for different reasons. Fine. But the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Not similar patterns. Not vaguely analogous situations. The same pattern. Ancient water source of unusual behaviour. Documented restriction or erasure of access. Absence of comprehensive pre-restriction records, official explanations that address the surface question without touching the underlying mechanism, and in several cases, a specific intensification of restriction during or after the period we've been calling the late 1800s reset. How do you coordinate that? How does that happen independently across 5 continents in systems managed by governments and institutions with no formal connection to each other? You either accept that it's coincidence, and I'm increasingly unable to do that, or you accept that something else is operating. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic, shadowy boardroom sense. Something older than that, something structural. A pattern of behaviour that doesn't require coordination because it emerges from a shared understanding of what these sources are and why they require management. What if the restriction isn't about protecting the public from the water? What if it's about protecting something in the water, or something the water does, from scrutiny? I keep returning to the food forest from the last episode. The systems that fed populations at scales we're told were impossible with pre-industrial agriculture. The systems that vanished quietly and comprehensively in the same historical window. What if they were part of the same network? What if water sources like these weren't incidental to those agricultural systems but foundational to them? What if the water itself, its chemistry, its temperature stability, its self-regulating behaviour, was doing something to the soil, to the plants, to the yields that we've simply lost the vocabulary to describe? And if that's true, if these springs were once part of an integrated system that sustained populations and landscapes in ways that official history has no framework for, then their restriction makes a different kind of sense. Not control of us exactly, control of the question. Shut down access to the water, and you shut down the evidence. Not the evidence that anything happened, but the evidence that something was possible. That a different relationship between human civilization and natural systems once existed. That the limits we accept as given were not always the limits. The silence was deafening when I tried to find documentation of the transition, not the restriction itself that's documented in various forms. The transition, the period between when these sources were accessible and integrated into surrounding communities and when they became managed, restricted, officially neutralized. That window, in case after case, is either extremely compressed or completely absent from the record. Things that were accessible are suddenly not, without clear process, without public record of the decision, without even in many cases formal notice that access had changed, not gradually restricted, not incrementally managed or there and then not there, open and then sealed. I want to close with something that I can't fully explain, and I'm going to be honest that I can't. There are indigenous oral traditions attached to almost every restricted water source I've investigated in the course of this research. Not as historical artifact, living traditions, communities that maintain knowledge about what these springs were, what they did, how they were used, and in conversation, after conversation, When I've had the opportunity to speak with people from these communities, I find the same theme recurring. The water knows, not metaphorically, not spiritually in the sense of a vague, decorative attribution, practically. The water in these traditions is understood as an active participant in the systems it supports, not a passive resource to be extracted, but something with behaviour, with memory, with a kind of organisational intelligence that expresses itself in the way it moves through a landscape, the way it responds to what's around it, the way it maintains conditions that sustain life across timeframes that dwarf any single human civilization. And when I map those traditions against the physical behaviours we've documented, the self-regulating equilibrium at Crater Lake, the continuously self-building architecture of Plitvice, the unmapped network beneath Beppu, the inexplicable mineral constructions at Hierve el Agua, and the organisms at Cuatro Ciénegas that predate every biological timeline we're given. What if the traditions aren't metaphor at all? What if they're technical documentation? What if the people who lived alongside these sources for generations weren't projecting consciousness onto water, but observing something real about how these systems behave, and encoding that observation in the only language robust enough to survive the kind of systematic erasure that technical records don't? The deeper I went, the harder this question became to dismiss. Because the official story about water, about history, about what existed before the modern cartographic record was established, assumes that complexity came after. That the world was simpler before us and we made it complicated. That the systems we encounter are either natural accidents or modern constructions, with nothing in between. But the water doesn't behave like an accident. And it's not modern. I don't know what these springs are. I want to be clear about that. I don't know if they're remnants of something built. I don't know if the restrictions are deliberate concealment or bureaucratic coincidence or something else entirely that I haven't thought of yet. What I know is that the pattern exists. What I know is that it persists across cultures and continents and geological contexts in ways that demand an explanation better than coincidence and more honest than we don't know. What I know is that the same historical window that appears to have systematically removed one set of self-sustaining systems from the landscape, the food forests, the agricultural networks, the distributed infrastructure of a world we're told didn't exist, also appears to mark an intensification of restriction around another set of self-sustaining systems. The water that nobody explains, the water that nobody can access, the water that was there before the record and is still there after it, flowing quietly under cities and national parks and protected designations, doing whatever it's been doing since before anyone currently alive was born to ask questions about it. What was it part of? What does it still do in the subsurface channels and the restricted zones and the fenced-off sections of perfectly legal tourist attractions that requires this much management? This raises a simple but critical question, not whether these sources are being kept from us. The restriction is documented. The question is, why? Why still? Why now? If the system they were part of is gone, dismantled, replaced, reset, what function do the restrictions serve? What is the continued concealment protecting? Unless the system isn't entirely gone, unless what was dismantled was the access, not the mechanism, unless the springs are still doing what they were always doing, underground and sealed and off-limits, the last operational components of something we no longer have a name for. Self-sustaining, self-correcting, quietly maintaining an equilibrium that no one is allowed close enough to observe. And if that's true, if the water is still running, still processing, still working, then the question isn't what it was. The question is what it's waiting for.